So I'm going to start. This talk with a disclaimer, and this disclaimer comes from a book called "A Tale for the Time Being" by Ruth Ozeki, which is a novel. And she says, this is in reference to an astrophysicist named Adam Frank. Professor Frank was referring to an old Zen koan about the sixth patriarch of Zen, who was illiterate. When asked how he could understand the truth of the Buddhist texts if he couldn't read the words, the sixth patriarch raised his hand and pointed to the moon. Truth is like the moon in the sky. Words are like a finger. A finger can point to the moon's location, but it is not the moon. To see the moon, you must look past the finger. To look for the truth in books, the sixth patriarch was saying, is like mistaking the finger for the moon. The moon and the finger are not the same thing. Not same, old Jiko would have said. Not different either. There's another way that same sentiment is expressed, and that is to study Buddhism without sitting, like we did at the beginning of this, is like eating a picture of a piece of cake. Okay. So having said all of that, we do a series of recovery talks and then a series of Buddhist talks with each referencing the other, and we're on a series of Buddhist talks right now about Buddhist teachers and writers that are important to us. This was hard for me because there's been several that have been really sort of fundamental for my finding my way into this practice and incorporating it into my recovery. The first one was Suzuki Roshi, who founded this temple, and he wrote a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which it's a small book, incredibly dense with ideas. I first picked it up when I was still drinking, and I tried several times to get in, and it was like a wall. I could not find my way in. And once I got sober and started coming here over the years, it's wormed its way in and has opened up to me. Another one was by Ihei Dogen, who was the guy that kind of brought Soto Zen from China like 1,000 years ago. And so his writings are real fundamental to Zen. The first book that my teacher suggested that we read together was a book by Thich Nhat Hanh called Old Path, White Clouds. And that's sort of it reads like a novel, but it's a life of the Buddha. And he suggested we start with Thich Nhat Hanh because he's inspirational, he's uplifting, he's very warm and loving. It's a wonderful way in. The next one that was important to me was Stephen Batchelor. He wrote a book called Buddhism Without Beliefs, and another one called Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist. And what I liked about Stephen Batchelor was that he showed me that I could be here and I didn't have to believe in superstition. I didn't have to believe in any Buddhist superstition or Christian superstition, or, I'm, by trade, my training is in science. And so, for me coming into, I got sober through AA, and for all the sort of Christian overtones that are there, I needed to find a way past that, and Batchelor really helped me with that. And then the next one that was really helpful was Pema Chodron, a book called When Things Fall Apart. And at a time when my recovery was really difficult and my life was really difficult, that book helped me so much. And it's all about leaning into the places that scare you, leaning into the places that are difficult, and that's where you find yourself. It's in those places. But I decided not to talk about any of those people. I decided to talk about Ruth Ozeki, who is a novelist and a memoirist, I guess. This is the book that I'm going to talk about. Ruth she's about 58 years old. She lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, and she practices with the Seattle Soto Zen groups. She also teaches writing at Smith College, and she's awesome. She's an awesome writer. I was up in Seattle in February, and I had a chance to spend the day at Seattle Soto Zen, and she gave the Dharma talk. And Ruth is a ordained Zen priest. She was ordained by Norman Fisher, who came out of this place. He goes up to Seattle frequently, and he's kind of a guiding teacher of several groups up there, and so he ordained her. So her writing is very Zen infused, and I find that it's a different way of looking at the teachings. It's looking at them sort of creatively as opposed to sort of academically. And so this book, and she talked about this book when she was there, it's called The Face, A Time Code. And what it was, she was one of a small group of writers that were invited by a small press in Brooklyn to sit in front of a mirror for 3 hours and write what came up. So she did that. She put a mirror on her altar and sat down with, I think, a big cup of coffee and her laptop, and just sat there, and just whatever sort of came to her mind in the course of this 3 hours, she would jot it down. And then she took those notes and fleshed it out, and it became a memoir of growing up in the Northeast, half Japanese. Her mother's Japanese, her father's American. And what she found is that by looking at her face, what she was doing is it became an examination of herself, and it asked sort of the big question of Buddhism, which is, what is our true nature? Who are we? After she had written this book, she told this story, she went to Japan, and she was touring various monasteries, and she came upon a monastery that it was a monastery of nuns. I don't know, I guess it's a monastery anyway, of nuns. It had been there over 1,000 years, and it was founded by a nun who sat in front of a mirror until she was enlightened. And so now the practice in this monastery is all the nuns sit in front of a giant mirror, and they sit there and contemplate themselves until they become enlightened. And so it's just one of those sort of like, okay. So she writes about this. She writes about a koan that came up for her while she was sitting. And the koan is, what did your face look like before your parents were born? She says, Zen koans are little allegorical nuggets designed to break your head on. They are ancient Gedaken's experiments, the dogged contemplation of which promises to lead to enlightenment. Only unlike Western philosophical thought experiments, koans don't operate rationally. And so, this idea of your face before you were born, your face before your parents were born, it's about, what is the essence of you, of each one of us. And the essence, sort of the crib notes on that, it's Buddha nature, is sort of what's understood. She also talks about, she made masks. One of the stories she talks in here, she went to Japan and she made those, I think it's called N-O-H masks. I'm probably saying that wrong. And in those, there's the actors that do this kind of acting, right before they go on to perform, they take the mask and they look at the mask and then they look at a mirror and they spend this time in a mirror room contemplating the mask and contemplating themselves, and they put it on and they go perform. And so that room is called a Kigami no Ma. So she said, my observation experiment has always been a kind of Nagami no Ma. Although very different from the objectless Shikantaza meditation that Dogen taught, the meditative investigation of my face in the mirror reminds me of another essay of his, in which he wrote, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things of the world. And I've also heard that said is to forget the self is to open up to all things in the world. The observation experiment, like meditation, has had the effect of waking me up to things that I ordinarily would not notice or have ignored. In the days and weeks that have followed, I find myself looking at people's faces more closely. So she talks about this fundamental question, and what struck me as she was talking, and she's not in recovery that I know of, that wasn't specifically brought into her talk, was that 12-step recovery in particular has recognized that this fundamental question of the self is at the root of addiction. It's at the root of our problems. It says in the big book on page 62, the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, although he usually doesn't think so. One of my favorite lines in all the literature is in the third step prayer, where it says, "Relieve me of the bondage of self." And so, what does that mean? I mean, that to me says that self is the problem, that ego is the problem, that we're in bondage to obsessive thinking, even when we put down the substances. My Al-Anon sponsor we read the big book together, and in place of drinking, he has me substitute thinking, because it's my obsessive thinking that causes suffering. We're in bondage to ourselves, whether we're drinking or not. Because in addiction, the world revolves around what I want and what I need. And when we're in that bondage of addiction, it gives us a false sense of ourself. And that's what Ruth is talking about here. These various masks that she talks about are falling away as she's sitting in front of the mirror. And she's finding there's things that she doesn't like. And she's also finding there's things that she loves about herself. And the concept that she brings up that really resonates with me with the most is a thing called the 3 marks of existence. And this was something the Buddha taught like on his second speech, whatever, his second discourse. And he went back to it a lot. And it's a real important Buddhist concept, because it talks about these 3 characteristics that all living beings have. And those 3 characteristics are that everything is impermanent, that nothing exists in and of itself without dependencies. That's also called no self. And that suffering is a part of existence, in part because of ignorance of the first 2. It's this false sense of self that we have. We have this idea that things are permanent. And what Buddhism says is that everything changes. And to me, that is the basis of the second step. This restoration to sanity says that we all have the potential to be sane, to be restored. We're not our issues. There's nothing about us. There's no afflictive habit that we've incorporated into us that can't be changed, because everything changes. And if you can really grasp that, that shows you the way out. Things might be bad right now, but everything changes. And then the less we cling to outcomes. As far as the no self, this is one that I think people trip up on a lot. Obviously, this is real. This is a discrete group of atoms. There's no doubt this isn't here. But what is not real is this sense that there is a me that is unchanging from my whole life, from before, after, this eternal soul, that whole concept. What Buddhism says is everything is dependent. So the person that I'm sitting right here is dependent on all of you. We're all co-creating each other right now. I'm the result of, obviously, my parents, but also my teachers and everyone I've come in contact with in my whole life. Generations before me, people I don't know, people in Washington, people in Sacramento, make decisions that affect me, and it becomes who I am. So I'm this ever-changing person, but Yeah, this ever-changing person. And Ruth Ozeki writes about that. She talks about her changing face and the changes that she's seen in it. And it's a marker. She calls the face a time battery. You know, within your face is all your stories, is all your history, this ever-changing who you are. And then part of that no self and part of being co-created is that you're intimately connected with a myriad of people. And what that means is that there's help available. You know, I like to think that I am, you know, self-sufficient. I don't need anybody. I got this. I'm good. I'm fine. You know, and the fact is, if I want it and if I'm willing to just open myself to it, all the help is available that I'll ever need. We're not alone. So the third one is suffering, and the deal with suffering is if we think that that I am stuck, that things are not going to change. You know, I was working the steps with a sponsee, and he was telling me, I'm just codependent. That's my issue. That's not going to change. And it's like, well, actually it will. You know, it will change. Because everything changes. But that's a cause of suffering, is when we hang on to these fixed ideas of ourselves. And also when we think that we're this independent person and that help is not available, that causes suffering. And you know, but it's also bigger than this. It says that there is suffering in the world and it's part of being human. You know, obviously to be in addiction is suffering, but being in painful relationships is suffering. Not getting what you want, losing something you have, being fearful of losing something you have is all suffering. Yeah, and even falling in love has the seeds of suffering in it. If two people are deeply in love with each other, unless they spontaneously die and, you know, and don't even know it, that it's coming, one of them's going to go first. And when that happens, the one who's left is suffering. So suffering is just part of the package. But it's only a little bit of the package. You know, there's also love, and there's also, you know, all these wonderful other emotions and realities. And Buddhism doesn't really talk about those a whole lot because they don't really need to be talked about. We all just kind of sit in them and enjoy them. But the suffering is something that we can do something about, and that's what the Buddha was talking about. Is that, you know, suffering exists. That's the first noble truth. And some people just stick right there, and I've heard people describe Buddhism as, oh, it's just all suffering. It's like, well, that's the first noble truth. And then there's a cause of suffering, and then there's a way to get rid of it, or to lessen it. So one of the things that we can do is we can use our knowledge of these three marks of existence to lessen our own suffering. We can start by exploring impermanence. You know, look for things that you cling to because you think that a situation or a relationship or a thing will last. And what happens if you just remind yourself that this will change? You know, it can give you a greater appreciation that, you know, I've got, you know, this thing in my life right now. You can also work with no self. You know, neuroscience has found out that, you know, the brain doesn't have a central driver. There's no you in the brain looking out at the world. But instead what the brain does is it gives rise to thoughts and feelings and emotions and reactions that all go into the creation of a feeling of self. And it feels like this has been unchanging since we were born. And actually it's not. And when you start observing that process, it's kind of amazing and it's kind of freeing. You don't have to cling to an image to yourself because it's just an image, and we can change that, and that's the basis of recovery, is that we can change it, and then we can work with suffering, observe the ways that you suffer, and start to see, and this is where working the steps comes in really handy. We start looking at these painful places, and we start to see our part, and when we see our part is when we can see how, okay, this is what I do, this causes that suffering. If I don't do this, I won't have that suffering. And, you know, It also helps to realize that other people are suffering as well, and try to avoid, and instead of trying to avoid it, see if you can have compassion arise for it. One of the teachings that Stephen talked about this last Friday was, this idea that everyone is doing the best they can at all times, and if we are willing to entertain that in other people, that's not an apology for what people are doing, but it's a call for compassion. That other people are suffering just like I'm suffering, and they're doing the best that they can. And then, like Pema Chodron says, try sitting with it, and sometimes it's helpful for me to just say, I'm sad right now. There are times when it's like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get a thing of Ben & Jerry's and I'm going to sit down and eat it. I am not hungry. This is strictly for feelings. That's what it is. Now, New York Super Fudge Crunch. Here we go. If I do that every day, I've probably got another program to go on. So, conclusion. So the challenge is, how do we, hold those obsessive thoughts and those wrong views we have about ourselves, and how do we use them to transform ourselves? And to bring it full circle, meditation is what gives us a key to this awareness. To sit meditation like we did now over time is to study the self. And we start to see these things, that the self is impermanent, that the self hurts sometimes, and that the self is intimately connected, and that there's help available. And that awareness of the emotions that we experience, the awareness itself can start to lift the siege of those afflictive emotions. So that's it. Thank you. So we'll take a minute and let the people leave that need to.